Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Dancing with Damage. I'm Ian, your resident philosopher.
And I'm Abby, your resident author.
And today we talk about reformation of police officers.
Yes.
And I think if you're following along in the social blueprint, the printed version, although I think it does come in online versions as well.
Yeah, I think for less than $3, or maybe with tax, about $3. So if you are interested, you can get it at whatever streaming platform you get your books from. And then there's a big cat hair in my book copy, but there won't be one in your virtual copy because you can't get cat hairs in your virtual copy.
Not yet, anyway. With special pre-order. No, but I always like the feel of an actual book. I think it comes in hardcover and softcover. Very fun. Plus, you get Planthead, who you can watch. No one knows what Planthead is up to.
We like Planthead.
And if you're following along in Planthead's copy, you will be, I think, at chapter 36.
Yes.
And the chapter is called The Snake in the Boot. And the idea is that even though at this point damage has been substantially reduced if things are going according to plan, again, we have the baby license, guardian center stream for those born unlicensed. We have the new education system and the apprenticeship program and an understanding of damage that's going to help really reduce the inflammation of damage at this point of the acts, which could be years, decades. It's down the road from now.
We have no idea how long it will take to implement. We make guesses, and throughout the book, we say it might be, but we don't know. It just depends on society, really.
That's right. So if you go to one place and plant an apple seed, it may take 20 years before you get an apple, depending on the soil and the rain and the sun. You go to another place, maybe it's got good manure. We love manure in gardening, I guess. And that apple tree is ready to go in 8 years or something like that. So really remember that the concept of the social blueprint is not a quick fix. It is rather, hopefully, the most expeditious fix and the most realistic fix that's addressing the root issue. But it will depend on different societies how quickly things are progressing.
Now I just really want to buy some apple trees.
Yeah, probably easier to buy a sapling. And that's, I think, what will happen too. Hopefully, if this idea takes root.
What?
Thank you. Just in case you wanted to know what that sounded like with a chipmunk voice. It's very, very endearing, by the way. I think if you have a friend who has raspberry bushes and you want some raspberry bushes, well, you can kind of just transplant some of their bush and you'll get raspberries much quicker. So I think as soon as some societies start with the social blueprint plan, which we hope they do, we hope that the idea of damage takes off, and even independent of us, it might take off, because to us, it kind of seems like not obvious, but it's sort of the natural next step of understanding the human condition. It will be easy for surrounding places to sort of piggyback off success as people go through it. But anyway, all this to say that even though damage will have been reduced, if these acts are being followed, it's still going to be a good idea for societies to really root out damage as much as they can. Abby?
Indeed. And we think one of the sectors in our nation that I think we can all agree has some room to make adjustments would be the art of the emergency services, specifically police officers. We hear stories where officers are amazing and they take their job very seriously and they try to do right by people. And that makes us really happy and our hearts feel warm and safe. But then there are stories you hear where some people abuse their power. Maybe they aren't properly trained. Maybe they don't care about being properly trained. And then incidents occur that make the public feel like they can't trust in these people. And the idea of a police officer is supposed to be a pillar in the community, someone you can trust, someone who is undertaking an immense responsibility to be the person to step in if things are going sideways. And some of the things police officers have to deal with are very negative, very hard to watch, very scary situations. So you do want the right person in the job. So we are making some recommendations.
That's right. And specifically when it comes to damage, you can think of a pool. If you had a pool growing up, or let's pretend you had a pool growing up. And what can get into pools are things like frogs and leaves and these sort of things. Why do you laugh?
Because when I was in grade 5, my parents moved to their current house and they told me there was a pool. What they didn't tell me was that it had been filled in to make a garden. So I sort of had a pool, but it wasn't a pool. And it just imagine you had a pool as a kid. I was like, I did imagine I had a pool as a kid. Instead, I just went and stole strawberries from my own garden that I was allowed to. I was pretending I was thieving. You have to pretend to have fun.
Well, so that struck a little too close to home for Abby. But I happen to know a pool owner who, in the summer, what they'll do if they want to stop leaves and things from getting in the pool between uses, there's like a pool cover you can roll over on top, and it will stop a lot of things from getting in. But then when they want to use it and have a pool party or something, they may roll the cover back and then use like a skimmer. You've ever seen those? They're on these long poles, kind of a blue net, fish around, and they try and get all so it looks nice and pristine. Well, the policies that target damage in a community that we've already discussed, specifically in Act 2, are going to be like that pool cover and ideally block most of the debris from getting in the pool of society.
Stop damage from getting into our souls.
Yes. Well, there you go. Abby always shoots from the hip and doesn't mince words. Your souls. You heard it here. But it makes also good sense, the same way the pool tender does, to skim away what does get in. And so a major part of damage and what's helping damage, the steroid to damage, is addictive drugs. It's sort of more or less a newish phenomenon. Addictive drugs, opium, and these sort of things have been around for a long time, but it's never sort of been as insidious as this day and age, the last couple of decades. And part of it is because the drug subculture is tightly connected to a damaged culture. The more damaged a society is, the more likely drugs are to infiltrate that society. It's sort of like if you have wood that isn't treated, then you're more likely to have fungus and things grow on it, or termites and ants and all these things, than if the wood is painted and everything like that and it's protected from those things. So all this to say is that there is right now, especially in Canada, and we've seen it in our lines of work, and you may have heard about it on the news, is that it can be tough for police officers to furrow out drugs and drug dealers and that kind of things.
Indeed. So what are some suggestions that we've made that might make it easier for this role of a peace officer to stop this drug underbelly of society from increasingly getting a stronghold?
Well, think about a drug dog at the airport, for example. You might have seen them. You might have seen them on TV.
They're really cute, but you can't pet them.
Can't pet them, and you definitely can't throw drugs at them.
Why would you ever throw drugs at a dog?
Oh, yeah.
Or in general.
Maybe they play fetch with it. I don't know. No, I hope not. Because they're drug dogs. I don't know. I'm still working on that joke. It's not ready yet. I don't think it'll ever be ready. Let's be honest. So a drug dog at the airport, you can imagine if you had a drug dog and you wanted it to ferret out the drugs, but you didn't let the dogs go into the baggage carousel area, or you didn't let the dogs go into certain parts of the airport, or it was difficult for them to get into there. There was like an electric dog fence or something. You would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. The dogs have got to be able to go wherever they need to go to smell, sniff out the drugs, and detect them, right? Well, in many developed nations, a pendulum has swung a bit too far in terms of putting up roadblocks for police officers to really, as effectively as they could, ferret out drug networks. And so what we would propose in chapter 36, chapter 36, and there's a fun fable in chapter 36. We haven't talked about it, but you can read about it in the social blueprint. All secrets are revealed, and some secrets not too. I don't know. There's secrets everywhere.
It's a secret to everyone, including us.
Yikes. So what we propose in that chapter is that sort of three things. One, that police officers be given much broader powers to investigate, especially drug networks in developed countries. But Abby, that's even more power than they have now if there were fewer roadblocks to be able to actually effectively search areas without so much red tape, essentially. So how do we counterbalance that great power we're suggesting that officers have at this point?
Not the level of the school of ruling, but like the school of ruling, you need to make sure that the people given this power went through a significant process with immense training, and to make sure that people with personalities that would be most likely to abuse their power would be removed from the system, but also to make sure that they were prepared. And I also think to make sure that there were significant consequences, because often I remember in university, they taught me about the thin blue line. And we were talking at the time, this was back in about 2013, in one of my classes. They were talking about how there were some cases of alleged police misuse of power, but they had other police units investigating. So if people doing your same job are investigating you, there's more of a likelihood that maybe someone would be willing to forgive something or not mention something. And of course, we hope that's not the case, but that is always a concern. So I think that this immense power and new training would also require more objective and more serious consequences if you are found to abuse that power, because we cannot allow for that to be the case in society.
Very true.
Yeah.
So the way we sort of argue it should happen, and we're more or less basing our notion off the model in Canada about police officers. I think around the world in developed countries, it's roughly the same, especially when it comes to the division of emergency services. Usually you hear about police, fire, paramedic. Those are the three sort of units that can respond to an emergency. So I always thought that was a bit inefficient. If you ever go up to an accident and there's a car accident on the highway, you see a fire truck and an ambulance and a police car, it's like, really? There was a flaming criminal who needed first aid. Like, you know what I mean? Probably it could be streamlined. And so what we argue in the book is sort of combining the emergency service into one. You could call it peace officer. That's the name we give it in the book. I'm sure there are more creative people out there who could think of a better name, because peace officer sort of already exists. But that's just a placeholder. Or not, if you like it. You tell us, society. But what's more important than the title is a unification of those services and lengthy training, as Abby mentioned, sort of like the school of ruling. If it took 5-7 years to become a peace officer, learning all these disciplines, emergency first aid and police tactics and also firefighting, that person would be quite elite.
And also, if you know anyone who works in emergency services, often there's a lot of overlap anyway. You'd be hard pressed to find a police officer or a firefighter who would not also be able to provide basic first aid if they happen to be first on the scene. I heard from a police officer, actually, that apparently firefighters are usually the first to come to a scene of any kind of emergency. Usually all three services end up being called to most incidents anyway, because all three skills are usually required, because firefighters are, again, also like paramedics, but with a lot of water at their disposal, which is kind of nice.
It's the best.
Yeah.
You gotta love water. No one ever brings fire to an. Well, they bring firepower sometimes. So I don't know. No one ever brings plants. Anyway, but they probably shouldn't. Well, I guess medicine is sort of like herbs and things.
I think we should move on.
Yeah, this doesn't make any sense. But going back to our point about broadening police powers in developed countries to ferret out, drugs especially, if a longer training were instituted and combining the three forces, you see, we have noticed that if you look in society and if you took a survey, you would probably find a very high level of trust on average towards firefighters and paramedics, but some level of skepticism towards police officers. Abby?
Yeah.
And that's sort of what Abby was talking about the thin blue line. And you often see sensational or not sensational, sometimes very well justified, stories of police brutality in the news. I don't think I've seen stories of like paramedic brutality at this point. I'm trying to think.
There have been some cases of paramedics using improper practices. There's been a few allegations in the past few years of people who misidentified what the emergency was, or didn't provide a medication or a tactic that they had that they really ought to have had they had basic training. So there have been a few, but nowhere near as many.
Nowhere near as many. So society already places a lot of trust in paramedics and firefighters. So by combining the three forces, we're hopeful that that trust can be inherited and sort of assimilated into the role of peace officers. And with the extensive training that focuses on straining out damaged, power-hungry people, because the kind of people who enter the police force and become abusive officers, it's the same kind of road that's being walked as politicians who get into positions of power and then abuse the people that they are meant to serve. Abby?
Yeah.
So the school of ruling is like a filter that filters out damaged people from entering politics, and we would want a school of peace officers that was longer and similarly structured to filter out negative officers. They inherit all the trust that firefighters and paramedics have, the skills, and then you have a very efficient, streamlined force of very compassionate, well-trained people who have a high level of trust infused in them with broad powers to ferret out drugs. And finally, we argue in the book about helicopters. Now, this
You often argue about helicopters, as too.
so in Canada especially, you have a lot of emergency response vehicles that are ground-based. We argue at this stage in the acts, if where possible, a sort of hovering aircraft should be instituted. Much more expensive, but there's a reason for it, that we want peace officers as much as possible to use hovering aircraft to put out fires or to respond to emergency situations. It's trickier, certainly, but in really dense urban areas, it might be the fastest way to get to point A and point B. Or in really rural areas, it's already sort of the standard.
I mean, in very dense populated areas, a lot of traffic, a lot of people. So even though the rule is you have to pull over when you see an emergency vehicle, I have seen myself in the past 2 months, like 5 or 6 times, where people just did not even attempt to pull over and let an emergency vehicle pass. And that was just in one small area in one place in Ontario. And you can imagine that's a problem everywhere. And in rural areas, sometimes, especially depending on the weather, there could be roads that are inaccessible or ill traveled or not plowed or something, especially if it's in the winter. And you shouldn't be denied access to help just because you happen to live in a place that is harder to get to. And also for extreme emergencies, often airlifting someone to a hospital, it is the best and most helpful way to save that person. So if you already are in a helicopter, it takes out the step of needing to call the helicopter. It's already there. And putting out a fire from above is just easier.
Well, that's how they put out forest fires, so it's got to be something to it. But yeah, we're going to argue about or argue for. I often say that, argue about. We're not really arguing about it. We argue for a military application for those hovering aircraft later, but just put that pin in there for now, the idea of a more helicopter-based emergency response force. And I guess, if you think about, for some reason, duct tape springs to mind. You know how it's just good for everything and everyone has a roll of duct tape in their house? We want to see the emergency services force sort of become like the duct tape of society. And it's just applicable in every situation. And everyone trusts duct tape,
And I also think because they're responding to more different situations, the teams that would respond would be more robust because often you have 2 to 5 medical professionals in an ambulance. You have at least 2, if not more, firefighters. Usually have at least 2 police officers, if not more. So if you had a team of like 6 to 10 people per unit, and all of a sudden there's more people, it's more diverse, it's easier to help with a situation if you have more hands on deck all at the same time. Plus, it also hopefully will help with transparency, along with we're already implementing body cams now. But if there are 10 people at a scene and they all have body cams on, it'll be really hard for them to abuse their power if there's 10 different perspectives. Because if all 10 body cams magically did not get turned on, I think the balance of probability would be against the peace officers in order to protect the people. You'd make sure that these officers were held to a very important standard.
And we often want to go back to a financial advantage too, because a lot of the policies we propose in Act 2 are very expensive. So how do we pay those off? Well, by trimming the fat in some social services in Act 3, that's how we justify it. And, if you have to buy a wrench and a box cutter and a screwdriver and a corkscrew and some pliers and everything like that, or is it cheaper just to have a Swiss Army knife that's very convenient and well made and just very useful utility knife? That's much less expensive. And in the same way, we see society saving money by not only streamlining and unifying these services, but also the result you get out of it. If you're able to reduce the amount of drugs in your country by even 25%, suddenly the justice system, welfare system, and healthcare system their budgets are going way down, or the cost to implement them is going way down, because there's such a tight connection between drugs, the vulnerable population, and those three social safety nets.
And you have to remember, as we say, and we will continue to say, damage is not your fault.
Mm-hmm.
It is not your parents' fault.
Mm-hmm.
It is, at this point, there's no one alive whose fault it is. Very almost impossible for it to be anyone's fault. But we still have to address it. And you can't blame vulnerable people who are suffering from an immense amount of damage if their lives are difficult. See, the problem with drugs is that there's peer pressure, which can try to encourage people or make people who are maybe hoping to be accepted by their peers feel included if they just participate. So that's one issue. But another issue that I think is an increasing problem in society, and this is my personal opinion, is that there are so many issues we're dealing with in so many areas of society. We've seen an intense whiplash of nostalgia come in, and all these adults going back to buying Pokemon cards, and everyone loves Disney, and all these things that were really popular in the 90s and 2000s, because it makes you feel safe to go back to that childhood state. You want escapism, because it's hard to always live in a reality where every single thing, food, health, politics, war, your finances, your house, your neighbors, the state of affairs, how your children are going to grow up. Will there be an environment for them? Will they even have jobs? It's so stressful. Everything in society right now is stressful. There isn't, maybe a cat show, maybe like those dog and cat shows on TV where they bring all the cats and they're like, this is the best cat. And then they pick up another cat and they're like, this is also the best cat. That is a very pure, I think, form of entertainment. But there's so little in society we can pinpoint and say, this is not stressing anyone out right now. This is just existing and doing what it's supposed to do. So because of that, while escapism is one option, drugs, unfortunately, can have a very low financial access point to get people into them, and is also a form of escapism that is very dangerous and very harmful for so many reasons. We won't get into them all because that'll take 5 hours for us to explain. But it is a problem because the more damage you are burdened with, the more you crave the ability to not have to focus on the fact you have all this burden to deal with every day. So escapism sounds nicer and nicer. And the more extreme the escapism, to the point where you're not even aware you exist, or you can't think about things because your mind is altered, that is a very appealing option. So it's important to take away those options so those struggling with their burden of damage are forced to sort of choose other options, or maybe ask for help or reach out to somebody and choose a different path. We need to sort of get rid of this extremely volatile, negative option.
So we can talk a bit about drugs and getting addicted to drugs. We've sort of avoided it up to this point because it's a little more nuanced. See, a lot of people, and from my line of work, I see it quite a bit in Abbey too, with the law and the criminal justice system, is that there is a subsect of drug users who were exposed to drugs sort of in utero and from a very early age from the home they grew up in. And that adds a bit of a medical dynamic to it, which is less about damage and more about genetic predisposition. So that does factor into damage. But what is interesting is we see young people that come from even that background and are able to eventually rehabilitate and get out of the drug subculture. And then we see people who come from seemingly quite nice homes get into the drug subculture. And, it mystifies people. They're not really sure how to explain that. And I always think of the example of that. I think it was some sort of botanist or some sort of scientist. And there was this question way back in the day. I think it was Leeuwenhoek, Dutch guy. Maybe it was him. Maybe not. Don't quote me. But there was an idea that weevils spontaneously grew in wheat or some sort of grain if you just left it in a jar, a container, because they would leave wheat in a jar or in an open glass container,
Like a vase?
like a decanter, like a bottle. And a few days later, there would be weevils in it. So everyone said, well, they must spontaneously occur. And they also thought that mice maybe spontaneously occurred in wheat if you left the wheat long enough. And so this Dutch guy, I'm pretty sure he was a Dutch guy. I hope he was.
It's a good story either way.
Yeah, just take the value out of the story, not the facts, okay? And so then this Dutch guy said, no. And he made this fancy, I guess he had to like custom order this glass blown bottle, but it was like a glass bottle, but it had kind of a swan neck before it got to the actual contents of the bottle. And what it effectively did was it meant that any spores or anything in the air that was going to travel into the bottle got caught in the S bend and didn't actually make it into the grain. And in that container, even though it was open to the air, no weevils formed.
Crazy.
And so I always like that, because whenever society can't really explain or just says it's spontaneous or random or can't be quantified why, one person who gets prescribed Percocets by their doctor for their knee pain becomes a junkie, and one person who gets prescribed the same Percocets doesn't. That's why I like the theory of damage so much, is because it's like that S bottle that explains the difference between outcomes of people. And so what I'm getting at is, when you have drug addiction in a society that has the resources for that person to rehabilitate, and the rehabilitation just never happens, we can't just say, oh, that's a bad person, or that person
doesn't want to be cured.
That's a common one. That's a good one, Abby. That the person actually, I said this already, but is a bad person. Not that. Rather, that the person is so damaged that the self-sabotaging fuel is not burnt out. And so they will continue to self-sabotage through drugs, through many, many vehicles, until all that gasoline of damage is used up. So, in a nutshell, that is why it is important to arm the love in society, which is the antidote of damage, with the sword of effective peace officer law enforcement, to slay the dragon of harmful drugs and show love to the society and help with damage. And it's not just the traditional street drugs you think of when we are thinking about drugs as a whole. Even more seemingly innocent drugs, marijuana and things that young people are vaping, which aren't classified as Schedule 1 substances, or in other words, highly addictive, have extreme negative ramifications on the brain. We see a lot more early onset schizophrenia and other major mental health issues that come from that. And don't take my word for it. This is sort of coming up in the scientific community, and so important to insulate the young brain, and any brain, but in particular the young brain, from that. And so that's why we want to bring forward the idea of the skimmer on the pool, the peace officer, the compassionate peace officer with one hand on their heart and one hand on their purpose. I don't know. They're compassionate and they're doing their thing. So, Abby, one thing I remember is that the pillars of play of the last chapter, we actually didn't get into it. I think our friends watching this will forgive us if we talk about the pillars of play of the last episode, which was the farming chapter. Mm-hmm. And in that chapter, in the last chapter, we talked a bit about moving towards traditional farming and re-ruralizing and rerouting at that stage through the apprenticeship program people into traditional farming in rural areas. And the pillars at play, I think, would be creating valuable work.
Yes.
Because if more people have to be in farming trade, that will create valuable work. Mm-hmm. I think it would. What else?
Any power lost is replaced with a better reward.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So even though the benefits of industrial farming would be neutralized, you would get the reward of more resilient farming community, the return of bees and all these sort of things. Mm-hmm.
And we should prevent isolation.
Prevent isolation. It's funny, when you move out of a highly densely populated urban center into a rural area, it doesn't matter what the population of that rural area is. It automatically, counterintuitively, but actually, you find that it reduces the feeling of isolation, because the more people there are in a city of millions, the more alone a person is in that city. And in a smaller rural community, the more surrounded they are by positive bonds. Is that it? Just those three?
Yeah, and then for the peace officers.
Oh, yeah. So for this chapter 36, what are the pillars of play, Abby?
Any power loss is replaced with a better reward. So again, peace officers would have to be more properly trained. They would have to be held to a very high standard. Mm-hmm. And they would hopefully be able to deal with any emergency situation faster and more efficiently than the systems we have in place now, and for less money, because one vehicle of transportation that is already used in cases for many different emergency situations rather than 3 to 12 different vehicles, depending on the situation, is more efficient. Policy increases individual social value by creating quality work. Very important to be somebody who can help deal with the worst moments in people's lives, or sometimes the best, like when a baby is born. That is absolutely something where you might need, if you are going into labor and you are not able to get to a hospital, you absolutely would need a medical professional to help you through that. It's a very vulnerable time, but that could be a positive thing. And policy should deny damaged people the power to injure.
That's right. And that one would be a comment on how currently the law, in some ways, is allowing the drug distribution network to stay intact. I mean, if you look at any opioid statistics in a lot of developed countries, you can see the rates rising. So obviously, the policies are not sufficient.
No, and I think one of the main things we argue for is we believe that most narcotics and different drugs are brought in via ship
Sure.
to our country. So I think one of the main expanded powers would be giving officers the ability to more thoroughly search more ships coming to port.
Yeah, that's a deep cut for sure. We can mention that briefly. So certainly, there is a global drug distribution network, and I'm sure Wikipedia will guide you in that. All this to say is that international shipping does, in a big way, contribute to the distribution of particularly opium, but other things as well. And so that's right. If you wanted to really get to the source of the gas leak, right to the crack in the pipe that's letting all that gas out, you would look to ports, and certainly a more expansive power in those port authorities and more resources there would go a long way to stopping that leak of poisonous gas into a place, into the homes, into where the children's live. That's very, Abby caught me off guard there, which is quite right. Anyway, we hope you tune in next time. If you have a comment about this, please leave it below. We are interested in answering any questions or well-constructive criticism or well-constructed commentary. Why can't I say constructed? Well-constructed commentary.
We always argue you should look at the argument itself, not the person saying it. So if you are willing to share your thoughts, comments, or questions about specifically the content of what we are saying, we are very happy to engage in that. And if you're willing, maybe consider subscribing, because then you won't miss any of our videos and our updates about all the fun social blueprint stuff.
Yeah, what she said.
What I said.
I don't know what I said. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Have a great day.